The next step in knitting the Gnome de Plume gnome is, after knitting the hat, we need to pick up stitches on the inside of the hat so we can knit the body downward and then have nothing to sew together afterwards. So the way this is going to work, we've knit our rolled brim, so we knit a whole bunch of rounds and then we started working the pattern, which was mostly purl stitches. What that's going to give us on this side is a brim where we've got mostly purl stitches, where we switch to some stockinette, is what it'll look like from this side. And you can see here, I found the spot on the brim where the stitch is a little hitched up. So here's a knit stitch, here's a purl stitch. What that means is that was the first stitch in the round, because in stockinette in knitting in the round, we kind of spiral up. So there's always this point where we kind of climb onto the last round. So I'm going to use that as my point for picking up, so that I know I'm starting at the beginning of the round. Okay, so we have a whole series of purl stitches facing us here, and then some V shapes. I'll bring this up a little bit to make sure that we can see. Each stitch is comprised of a left leg and a right leg. They're all sort of V shapes. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up the right leg of each stitch. So I'm going to tug this one down because it's a little fluffy. And you may find that using your thumb to pull that out of the way helps a lot. So I'm going to pick up the right leg of this one, skip the left leg. Pick up the right leg, skip the left. So right leg. And then one of the things we did after we were done knitting that rolled brim was we increased a few stitches. So you may find little gaps where there's sort of like a little hole with a stitch going above it. That's okay, just ignore that and go to the next right leg. By doing that, what you're going to get is you're going to get 52 stitches on the needle. Now, you'll notice that what I'm not doing is I'm not picking up and knitting. I'm trying to make this tutorial extra easy. So what picking up and knitting would look like, and it's what we do usually when we're picking up stitches. So when picking up and knitting, we would have the yarn, we would go through the leg that we need to be going through, and then we would grab the yarn, and it's always a little awkward for the first one. We would grab the yarn, bring it through that loop, and make the new stitch instantly. So then we would find the next right leg, we would go through, we would grab the yarn, and we would knit into the stitch. But I'm trying to make this tutorial extra simple. If this is what you want to do, go ahead. This is definitely one of the options. But for this tutorial, I'm going to be slowing everything down and kind of really stepping us through. So we need to pick up every single V-stitch, or every single right leg, and then skip those little increase spots where there's those little holes. Don't worry about those. If this still is a bit tricky, there is no law that says you have to pick up stitches with the same thickness of needle that you use to knit it. So you could go even thinner. It doesn't really matter in knitting what size needle you knit off of. What really matters is the size of the needle you knit onto. That's what determines stitch size. So if you are struggling, try using a thinner needle, or if the needle you used is so sharp that it's splitting your stitches, use a blunter needle. This is a point where you can play around a little bit. And speaking of playing around a little bit, at the end of this, you should have 52 stitches, but if you don't, it is not the end of the world. Just make one or knit two together. If you're off a little bit in this round where we're joining the body to the hat, it's not a really big deal. One last little thing. Before you start knitting, make sure that you're knitting on the needle closest to you. This will help you make sure that you knit stockinette fabric. Sometimes I get emails from people who've picked up the stitches for their gnomes and start knitting, and somehow they manage to produce a reverse stockinette. And what's usually happened is they've actually knit on the back needle. It is totally possible to knit in the round using the back needle, and it will produce a perfectly fine fabric, but if you're doing it to make a stockinette fabric, that's not what's going to happen. So what you need to do is you need to make sure that you're knitting the needle closest to you. So I'm going to grab my body yarn, I'm going to wedge it between the two tips here of my DPNs, and then I'm just going to start knitting. So we've picked up 52 stitches, and now we're going to knit. Well, we've picked up 52 loops, and now we're going to make 52 stitches is a better way to phrase that. So at the end of this, You're going to have a body attached to the hat that doesn't need sewing on. You will need to sew in this end, of course, and there's a place in the pattern where it tells you to stop. Sew in that end and then stuff the body, which is the next video that I will be filming. So I will see you for that tip shortly. In the meantime, happy knitting and happy gnoming.